Hi, welcome to Sidebar. My name is Adrienne Fanjoy, and I'm joined by my colleague Brent Marks, and we're here and excited to chat about May Day. So, Brent and I are both colleagues in the Labor and Employment Group
And friends.
and friends, according to him. Uh, and we're both very passionate, as is everyone in our group, about workers' rights, protecting folks' right to a safe workplace, a workplace that respects their human rights, their any if there's a collective agreement, then the rights set out in a collective agreement. And so, you know, Labor Day or May Day or International Workers' Day, as it's called sometimes, is one that's really important to the labor movement. So we're happy to be here to chat about it with you. So Brent, maybe you can start us off by just telling us, what is May Day?
Absolutely. So, May Day is also known as International Workers' Day. It's recognized around the world as a celebration of worker solidarity and labor movements, but it arises from a number of historical events. And it has roots both in Europe and in North America, and remains a bigger day in Europe, as we have sort of deemed a different Labor Day in Canada and the US now. But the date was originally chosen by the American Federation of Labor to commemorate a general strike in the United States, which we'll talk about a little bit later, in 1886. Um, and following that, there was a Congress, the International Workers' Congress, which was held in Paris in 1889, which established the Second International, which was a political international coalition of labor and progressive parties. And they deemed May 1st to be an annual celebration in recognition of the Haymarket Affair, as well as to popularize the demand at the time, which was for an 8-hour workday, which is something obviously we take for granted now. So it is a national public holiday in a number of countries. However, in Canada and the US, it's fallen a little bit out of the spotlight and tends to be more muted, and has been replaced with Labor Day, which happens in September. And depends who you ask, you'll get a lot of different reasons why this has happened. But one suspicion is that May Day had roots in mass strikes and radical organizing, sometimes events that led to violence. And this made governments and employers uncomfortable. And some historians have even taken to viewing the September date as a scab holiday, one designed in an attempt to diminish the power of workers and unions. That's a little beyond the scope of our conversation today, so we won't opine on that. But perhaps the takeaway, when looking at how May Day arose, is to remember that it's not abstract, it's not ceremonial. It's a day to remind everyone that everyday protections that we take for granted, something like the 8-hour workday or the weekend, they exist because workers organized collectively and fought for those rights. So perhaps we can have a quick look at before labor rights, before collective bargaining. Why was organizing necessary, and what was it like to work in those days?
For sure. So, I mean, the history of labor organizing is, just very rich. And part of that is because the working conditions back, in the 19th century were really horrible. Like, there's no way to minimize some of, the conduct that was normalized there. We had, 10 to 15 plus hour working days. We had child labor. We had workplace accidents almost being like the norm in some industries. And of course, back then, there wasn't, WSIB, there wasn't EI sickness benefits. If you were injured on the job, not only did you likely have no recourse against your employer, which today you would, regardless of if you're unionized or not, but you would be without income. And so you and your family would, be facing starvation. You would potentially be, in a position where then you're, having to send your kids to work in order just to feed the rest of the family. And so it was just really these awful conditions where, because there was no labor standards, or to the extent that there wasn't really any meaningful way to enforce protections for workers. Because of that, employers were really doing the bare minimum.
It sounds intolerable.
It was intolerable, Brent. And so they came together. Workers banded together as, a collective voice. They have a lot more power, and they faced really severe consequences for doing that. And we're going to talk more about that later. But union leaders were often criminalized. It was huge risks that these people took, but because of their sacrifice, we have some of the protections and rights that we take for granted today.
Absolutely. I think we can kind of highlight that a little bit at looking at what became the eventual establishment of the 8-hour workday. And as I talked about a little off the top, this came as the result of something that's now referred to as the Haymarket Affair, which was, the aftermath of a general strike that happened in the United States. And this particular event happened in Chicago. So in May 1st of 1886, there was a general strike, which is basically a situation where workers across sectors, workers across all kinds of different areas strike at the same time, to put a halt to production, to put a halt to everything, and grind, the economic functioning of an area to a halt, and to express their power. So there was a general strike that had been organized by labor unions. It was estimated that anywhere between 300,000 to 500,000 workers went on strike at the same time for one very central and very simple demand. They said 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. Unions are never one to turn down a catchy slogan, and that's what they went with. So in Chicago, there was days of strikes that culminated ultimately in a rally at Haymarket Square. On the 4th of May, somebody threw a bomb into the crowd, and at the police, who were acting to disperse the gathering. The bomb exploded, police opened fire, and ultimately 7 police officers and 4 other people were killed. The labor organizers, who, despite no proof that they participated in any of the violent acts, were referred to as some by anarchists. They were convicted of conspiracy and ultimately executed. A few years later, even the Illinois governor pardoned a number of those convicted, calling them victims of hysteria, packed juries, and a biased judge, noting that the state had never discovered who threw the bomb or produced any evidence to show any connection between those who were ultimately punished for the event. So it's important to remember this event, not only because this is sort of where May Day, ultimately was the May Day was chosen to commemorate this affair, but it was also a reminder that the 8-hour workday that we certainly take for granted did not arrive overnight. It arose because of the struggle of these workers, and that day became a global symbol of working class demands, and has been adopted to honor that sacrifice. But I think what we can really do now is look at the early origins of workers' rights here in Canada and here in Ontario, as it is a rich history as well, and one, which I think we should explore, because that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so interesting just to pick up on that word hysteria. Often today, when we see the media or companies talking about what workers are fighting for, they adopt this tone to suggest that these demands aren't reasonable. And, there's a lot of fear mongering about costs sometimes. And, that type of rhetoric has been around for ages. And
Mm-hmm.
we'll get to it a bit later, perhaps, with the strike for maternity leave. But at that time, too, employers, again, were saying, you want to have a baby, you pay for it. Mm-hmm. Why should we, top up your maternity leave benefits? So
absolutely,
we're always, it's just a good opportunity to reflect on how the same sort of rhetoric is repeated, even, in a different time.
Something like an 8-hour workday might have sounded radical. It may have sounded radical at that time, and It doesn't sound radical to us now. And perhaps some of these things that seem radical are not so much. Right?
imagine the outrage when they were going to lose their child workers.
Yeah,
We have to never forget. So there was the 9-hour movement that was in Toronto, 1872.
Mm-hmm.
So that was Canada's first national attempt at labor movement. And both unionized and non-unionized workers were united in that. At its height, there was a collective force of about 1,500 workers who were demonstrating in Hamilton in kind of a parade-like fashion. And some say that that's the precursor for Canada's Labor Day. That was really the beginnings in Canada, I think, of a unified protest movement. What happened there is the Toronto printers went on strike to reduce their workday from 12 hours to 9. There was a lot of controversy. Again, this fear-mongering and, just employers being flabbergasted that someone would dare to, ask for a reasonable work day. It just kind of showed how antagonistic the
relationship was between them.
Exactly. And trade unions were declared to be illegal. And they were judged to be conspiracies in restraint of trade. And that was, in applying an old British law. So after that really kickstarted a few different legislative changes that, ultimately led to Prime Minister John A. Macdonald passing legislation that legalized trade unions in Canada through the Trade Unions Act. And that was in direct response to the arrest and criminal prosecution of 24 leaders of the printers' strike that had been, orchestrated by his political opponents. So this was a huge win in Canada for unions, for workers. And again, it's because those, in this case, in the printing industry, came together to, fight for more reasonable working conditions.
Mm-hmm. And I think it shows sort of how some of these rights and benefits that have been secured really comes about in piecemeal fashion because while the government did legalize the right to join a union, it was still illegal to picket at the time. So, there was still a lot of, teeth taken out of the ability to, work together and associate together as a union.
And we see that still today where, like in Canada, it's the Section 2D is the right under the charter, but we have to fight continually to make that right meaningful. Absolutely. So there's still so many barriers today that we see where, sure, you have this right, but if you don't have powers like, the power to strike, if you have governments threatening to use the notwithstanding clause all over the place, like that really, harms everyone. And, we should all be very concerned about government overreach in that way.
Absolutely. And I mean, here we are talking about things that occurred, 150 years ago, but something like the, notwithstanding clause and the reaction from the people in Ontario to express their, displeasure with the Ford government's legislation is still very, it's also a modern issue. And some things have changed and many have not. But maybe it's, we can now look also to the rights that have been enshrined in the Charter, I think, as you touched upon there, and just to see how far we have come. But looking back, there's another really interesting, I think, historical event that brings some of this into view. And I remember reading about this in grade 10 and then reading more about it in the previous few days. But I'm talking about the Winnipeg General Strike, which was one of the largest strikes in Canadian history. For 6 weeks in 1919, over 30,000 workers walked out and demonstrated their collective power. And they brought economic activity to a standstill in Winnipeg, which, believe it or not, at the time was the third largest city in the country. And it was largely about recognition, fairness, and dignity. And it grew out of the increasing social inequality and impoverished conditions that arose after the First World War. There was a lot of economic instability, and we're not historians, so we're doing our best. But there was a lot of frustrations. There was low wages and raising prices and high inflation. and discrimination facing immigrants, some of the same things, poor housing and health, things we still deal with today. But wages had not kept pace, and there was a real resentment amongst workers who had seen employers make enormous profits during the war. Many of these workers also fought in this war and then returned to a world that was simply not fair. So the Winnipeg General Strike, it arose, as I said, in 1919, and there was serious opposition to the strike by local business people and professionals that called themselves the Citizens Committee of 1,000. I suppose compared to the striking workers of tens of thousands. But they encouraged employers not to give in to the strikers, and they attempted to stir up resentment of alien immigrants who they alleged were the principal leaders of the strike. And they put pressure on the government. They published a newspaper, the Winnipeg Citizen, that claimed that the so-called general strike is in reality revolution, or a daring attempt to overthrow the present industrial and governmental system. So federal ministers came to Winnipeg. They arrested, well, they didn't, but the strike leaders were arrested. And there was a climax that led to 2 people being killed on a day called Bloody Saturday. And this still matters. That strike has, deeply shaped labor politics, across the country. And it was an event that really influenced later organizing in some of Ontario's most industrial cities, Hamilton, Oshawa, which I have to, as someone who comes from Durham region, I have a special place in my heart for Oshawa, but also in Windsor, where a lot of auto manufacturing was going on. But really, this Winnipeg General Strike was a change to the way that Canadians understood collective bargaining, as well as just generally, class consciousness coming out of the First World War.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good time to talk about some of Ontario's beautiful industrial cities.
Yes, such as Oshawa.
That's right.
Near the hometown of Brent.
That's right. Yeah. Durham region is a fine place to live.
Yes, and I'm actually from Winnipeg, so it turns out our roots are very.
There you go. Honest.
Exactly. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Oshawa's GM strike. There's a book that, I would recommend on this called The Truth About the 37 Oshawa GM Strike. So this is 1937. And essentially auto workers in Oshawa demanded union recognition at the General Motors plant after a bitterly fought strike that pitted them against the anti-union government. At the time, the Ontario Premier, Mitch Hepburn, attempted to break the strike using police powers. He created a special police force task force, which was deemed the Sons of Mitch's. And again,
catchy.
Exactly.
Catchy,
it's all about the catchy slogans. And as like we've seen with many other cases, when governments take these really harsh tactics against its own people and its own workers who are contributing in the foundation of its economy, that doesn't always go so well with the public. So
I think people see that it could be them next.
Exactly. So, there was public and financial pressure that led to GM eventually capitulating, and they resumed production after only 2 weeks of work stoppage. So as a result, the workers were successful in getting union recognition. They were, for the first time, part of a true international union that had over 500,000 members across North America. And it was a win that, further established industrial unionism in Ontario. And it's been downplayed in history at times. And part of the downplaying of these successes, it's suspicious in its own way, because they're trying to undermine the degree to which class struggle organizing principles were fundamental to their success.
Absolutely. That's what created the large scale support amongst the public against the government's heavy actions, and I think that's really a good template for sort of modern collective bargaining, where we see people being members of large national or international unions and their sub-locals. But it affirmed that, unions couldn't just exist, but they could fight and they could win, and they could do it in 2 weeks. And it's a great example. And I mean, I think it segues into another example out of the auto industry with a Ford strike that happened with Ford, the auto manufacturer, not the premier, where workers demanded further union security in the sense that unions at the time also were needing to ensure that the dues that their members paid were sufficient to cover their operating costs, but also that the gains that they had managed to get out of the employers were something that all workers enjoyed. And at the time, Supreme Court of Canada Justice Ivan Rand arbitrated the deadlocked and volatile strike in Windsor, which was one of the country's longest post-war strikes. And he ultimately ruled in a decision that is now referred to as the Rand formula, that all workers have to pay union dues. At the time, he saw this as a compromise and denied the union's demand that the Ford plant become a closed shop, which would have meant that they could only hire, union members or pre-existing union members, as opposed to hiring people who would become union members. And then he also ruled that all workers who fell within the bargaining unit, so within the union, whether they were actual union members or not, so if they did the same job as the union members and they enjoyed the benefits of unionized employment, such as, better salary, all of the things that unions manage to negotiate on behalf of their members, he found that even if you weren't in the union, but you did benefit from its advocacy, then you had to pay union dues. You had to contribute. And that helped to pay the union's cost of negotiating and administrating the collective agreement, which is, I suppose we've thrown that word around a lot. Basically, at its most simple definition, it's just a contract. It's a contract that applies to every worker with one employer. And so basically Rand reasoned that, employees couldn't be compelled to join a union, but those who opt out shouldn't get a free ride in terms of enjoying wages or benefits that resulted from, a collectively bargained contract. And this still underpins labor relations today. And whether that is still effective or not, that's the subject for another podcast. But it's a stark contrast to what we see in many states in the United States, where where there's a right to work approach, basically being that state laws prohibit your union security agreements, otherwise agreements between employers and labor unions, and that those agreements, can ordinarily be incorporated into union contracts to require employees who are not members of the union to pay the dues and pay the cost of representation. And in many states, that's not permitted, basically being that you can enjoy all of the benefits of the union but not pay for it. And that's not something that is able to happen here, and that's because of the Rand formula. So it's another example, I think, of legal structures and labor protections that we see as critical, being born directly out of Ontario and from workers in Ontario. And it's a good reminder that sometimes labor unrest has to hurt. It has to be difficult, and it's only after those difficult times that you get these wins. So I think, it's one of those things that maybe someone's sitting there now and they're thinking, well, I'm not in a union. Hot diggity dog doesn't really help me out. I'm really happy for those people and their great jobs, but, what's it ever done for me? Well, and the thing is, it has done a lot for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, no, I can. And that's one of the great things about unions is they change the standard.
Yeah.
So they, some individual, some worker has an idea of how something could be more fair. And then that, catches on.
Yeah.
And an example of that we can look to is thinking about maternity leave in Canada. So in 1971, Canada, the federal government introduced, maternity leave. I think it was 15 weeks. It was through like the Employment Insurance Act that was in place at the time. And so you got 66% of your pay for the first 15 weeks after you had a child.
Which isn't so long.
Yeah, which is not not very long. And so that happened in 1971, and unions quickly, started brainstorming about how they could make things even, more equitable for women, and eventually for fathers who, are also involved in
It's true. It's true.
the family. Some. And so it was actually some public sector unions in Quebec who had the first bit of success with getting employers to agree to top up the employment insurance 66%. But what was really like the monumental shift in Canada was the 42-day strike from CUPW.
That's right. The postal workers.
Yes, the postal workers. And what they, did is they took a stand, and they, said that even though, all of us don't necessarily need to take maternity leave, but as a collective, we're going to come together. We're going to push on this. We're not going to back down. They went on strike for 42 days, and they were successful. They got, a top up to 93%, where women previously would have been losing 40% of their salary just, to have a baby. Now that interruption in their income was far less severe. We, because of maternity leave, including top-ups, which are extremely common for unionized and non-unionized employees alike. That's because of these early wins by, by unions who pushed to make that normalized. Because employers know, like, if they, in this day and age, if they want to attract the best workers, they have to give those sorts of benefits
Absolutely.
that are competitive. And so we have a union to think for that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's a good example of how some of these union wins have radiated outwards. And I have another slogan. And, if you look around, there's the slogan that rising tides lift all boats.
Yes.
And of course, as things improve for, unionized workers, the non-unionized workplaces still need to remain competitive, and that's the tide, and it's rising boats. And that's just a great slogan to add. So there are other examples, I think, of I suppose, safety nets that have come into place because of advocacy from workers and unions. And one of those things is the WSIB, which is something near and dear to my heart. As a law student, I worked for Advocates for Injured Workers, helping people with their WSIB claims. And those WSIB roots lie in the extremely dangerous workplaces of the early 20th century, where horrible injury and death was a reality. And, as you touched upon before, could be crippling in the sense that you would no longer have any sort of income or protection, and often force children into the workplace, forcing other family members to support each other, and it was very difficult. So over 100 years ago, Sir William Meredith tabled a report in the Ontario legislature, which would become known as the Meredith Principles. They are, the naming is not quite as creative as the slogans, but they represented a historical compromise where employers fund the compensation system and share liability for injured workers, but in return, injured workers receive benefits while they recover, but they can't individually sue their employers. So this was a sort of historic compromise, or a grand bargain, that helps to ensure a non-adversarial system by design, or hopefully a non-adversarial system. It does become a little less black and white, but where workers get benefits without proving fault in exchange for giving up the right to sue employers, as I said. The 5 pillars of these sort of Meredith principles are a no-fault compensation regime. So workers receive benefits regardless of how the injury occurred, but employers are protected from lawsuits. So employees don't have to go through the difficult task of, proving negligence, which involves looking at issues like causation and a standard and duty of care and all these complicated things that lawyers have to deal with. But it allowed sort of this no fault regime to be put in place, and it operates off of collective liability. So employers as a group share the financial responsibility for injuries. So they share the cost through a common fund, and theoretically this would also, encourage a higher floor of safety in the workplace. The benefits, there's security to them. It's managed independently from employers, and it ensures that compensation is available when it's needed. It's administered independent of government. They're not bound by, they're bound by some internal legal precedents, but they have the ability to, to provide benefits where appropriate without ideally too much government intervention. And this is their exclusive jurisdiction. There are workplace compensation boards that have the sole authority to manage and investigate and decide on these claims, and they have their own tribunals as to oversee those decisions. And at a final level, you might take such a decision to judicial review, but there are largely an exclusive jurisdiction of people who are well versed in that area that make decisions. We talk again a lot about our historical things, but in my lifetime, I can even remember, a lot of things that have happened in Ontario, such as the days of action in response to Mike Harris. I think we don't need to spend too much time talking all about that, but it was a series of province-wide protests and strikes. It was community-based and not just workplace-based, and they were historic and dynamic strikes, and hundreds of thousands of people participated by walking off their jobs for a period of time, by marching and chanting and picketing. And it was another sort of turning point, and perhaps, unfortunately, not in the best way, but one that shows that we have to continue to fight to protect these kind of rights, because it's very easy for them to go away. And I think we saw that actually quite recently in 2022. I don't know if you want to touch on that a bit.
Yeah, so 2022, that's one of the more recent examples, but unfortunately it's, we're seeing more and more of this where, governments are really trying to impose contracts in, a manner that undermines really
I think about the flight attendants recently with Air Canada.
Yeah. But yeah, in 2022, so that was, when the Doug Ford government passed legislation to impose a contract on about 55,000 education workers. And these education workers were really like some of the more vulnerable workers in that industry. So, it was really kind of heavy-handed to those who are already, don't have, they were relatively lower income. They individually, it would be hard to see how they could fight back against, against low wages. Sometimes, there's lots of safety issues in classrooms now, etc. So I think it was custodians, early childhood educators, and administrative staff. So they attempted to impose heavy strikes for workers who were going on strike, but they later repealed that following massive backlash. And CUPE also threatened a general strike of thousands of education workers in Ontario alongside other unions who pledged to do the same. So because of these threats, the Ford government did actually back down. Which just shows the power not only of an individual union, but also unions working together, and also critically, public opinion.
Absolutely.
Public opinion and does so much to influence governments, and that's why, looping back to the notwithstanding clause, which Ford attempted to use during this time, it is so vital that the public is, communicates its outrage every time the government tries to use that clause to skirt its obligations under the charter. So you're absolutely right. Like, we see these issues are still, really live topics. We're still, you and I both, we have cases on our, as part of our work where we are trying to advance, the fair application of benefits, the fair application, the non-discriminatory application of promotions, safety in the workplace.
Absolutely.
Dealing with, in a meaningful way, violence, sexual violence, anti-Black racism, all these things that are unfortunately part of our workplaces still.
Yeah.
Unions have such an important role, really,
Absolutely.
in, taking a stand.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show that, we have systems in place that allows for, people like us and labor advocates to get accountability for actions that may violate the law, and those processes and those safety nets are in place because of things that that previous workers and unions have fought for. And I think we could sit here all day and go through a million and one historical examples, but people have to get back to their lives. So I think it's that's really the message that I hope we've been able to kind of convey here, is that this is, when we look at May Day and we look at living, or at labor rights, it's really a living history. And we assume some of these things are permanent. No one's going to take away the 8-hour work day or the weekend or anything like this. But I think we have seen many examples of governments and employers trying to backslide and trying to change this balance. And we see it with stuff, like the increase in precarious work, for issues especially involving unionized staff, where employers contract out to bring in non-union staff who they can pay less. And we see stuff like gig work, where there's been some very interesting developments in terms of trying to unionize people who do gig work and app-based work. But we see, when your employer is a computer app, it's very hard to, or a phone app, maybe that makes me sound old to say computer app, but there's very few protections when your employer and the person that dictates what you do at work is an algorithm. So, I think we can, take a final reflection as we leave, and just remember that it's not about nostalgia necessarily. We've been nostalgic and talked about historic things here, but it's a reminder that the rights that we rely on were built deliberately, and they have to be preserved in the same way. And, we have to keep fighting for these things, or else they will slip away. And, that's why we'd encourage everyone to go out on May 1st and, and march and find an action and a group to support. And if you ever have questions about unionizing your workplace, or enforcing your rights in the workplace, or if you're a non-unionized worker and you think something is going on at work that shouldn't be, well, I would really encourage people to talk to a labor employment lawyer like us and our team members, and get some sense of where you stand. Because if we don't hold people and employers and governments accountable for these things, then they will go away. And we're going to keep trying to stop that.
Yeah. Well said.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Brent, for joining me today. And I had a great time learning more about the history with you.
Likewise. It's very nice to be here on Sidebar.
Yeah.